We worship a God who speaks. We worship a God who creates through word, whose people have chosen metaphors to describe this God's power, actions, and very presence. In naming mystery, we fall short of the experienced reality, but what else can we do? We are only human. So we talk about fire and wind, and anyone who has lived through a tornado will know why. Anyone who has lived through a wildfire will know why. So we talk about the breath of God. After all, the Hebrew word for spirit is also the word for breath and wind. And if we have lived through a pandemic where the virus is probably not spread by touching things, probably not by droplets on surfaces, and not even by coughing or sneezing, but by the essential life-giving action of breathing in and out, of speaking, then we understand the power of simple breath to give life and to take it away. We worship a God who is that powerful. We talk about tongues of fire dancing over people's heads as they speak a language they don't know how to speak. In our story today, the people who heard this language weren't just foreign visitors. These were Jewish people whose ancestors had been dispersed and dispossessed, who now called foreign lands their home. But this God who creates with word and fire and wind is still their God. In returning for a harvest festival, they are shown new life. They are shown the birth of a new way that is not bound to the temple in Jerusalem, but God on the move, like the wind, like fire. Nothing can stand in God's path. The seeds were planted, the harvest is gathered, and it is time to begin again. The power of God, leaving people baffled and unconvinced, leaving people in awe, because it's not power you can see. And like Thomas, most of us want to see to believe. It's not just about appearances and not wanting to seem gullible. This is the core of our nature. How do we believe in something that we cannot perceive in any way? Well, we forget that perception isn't always firsthand. We can perceive gravity because the apple falls to the ground, not because we walk in and out of it or can turn it on or off. We can't control it and see it or touch it, but we know it's there by the effect it has on the world around it. We can see the power of wind even if we can't see the wind itself. We see it moving trees, objects, we see its destruction, we see its blessing. Sometimes there seems not to be a breath of movement in the air, but somehow a bird finds a stirring in the air, enough to lift a wing and sing gratitude as she floats on nothing. The power of nature is overwhelming and fierce and sometimes violent, but left to itself, always recreating and repairing, regrowing, reforming. New life in spring replaces the spent life of winter.
So this is actually a great act of hope to be doing these, because I'm seriously thinking that next year we will be able to be close enough to each other to put ashes on each other's foreheads. Yeah.
This is the language we use to describe a God we cannot see or touch or smell, but a God whose absence can leave us feeling breathless and purposeless. A God whose life is our own, whose power is our power, and whose truth is given to us by this thing that we also call breath and wind, this spirit, this advocate or paraclete, this helper, this comforter, this empowering force that binds us as people, that ignites life and life-saving love and makes humanity possible. The spirit that compels a Hungarian immigrant to devote her life to a science that others rejected and belittled, harnessing the power of mRNA to fight disease. She sacrificed the respect of her peers, funding, and fame to pursue something she knew in her heart was important. And in 2020, the scientific world used her research to create the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that will help bring this pandemic to an end. Catalin Carico wouldn't necessarily use that kind of language to explain her determination and certainty. But that spirit has danced over the heads of scientists, poets, athletes, community leaders since time immemorial. The language of God is the language of love, and it's terrifying because it moves and changes our world on a scale that we cannot fathom, let alone control. So we try to tame it. And one of the ways we do that is through our own language. By naming, we tame, and we think we can control it. "25 years ago, Dr. Gary Chapman, a family counselor, coined the idea of the language of love. And hundreds of thousands of couples have found a way to live together by learning whether their spouse speaks the language of affirmation, the language of service, or the language of quality time, the language of receiving gifts, or the language of physical touch. Helping in building human relationships. But in a world where God is carefully controlled, love becomes carefully controlled, and we can begin to think that this human love is the beginning and the ending of love, and love then becomes about romantic gestures and human action to help sustain a human bond and ultimately a stable civilization that is based on this family unit. But what happens when God so loves the world? God gives us gifts and touches us and affirms us, it's true. But the power that is unleashed on Jerusalem in the book of Acts, the power that Jesus alludes to in the Gospel of John, is not the power of gentle compromise that helps us build lives together. It is the power of life and death itself. It is the power that gives, that destroys when the thing is finished, and offers new life in its place. It is the power that sobs with us when life is destroyed too soon. It is the power that rejoices with us when life is created unexpectedly. It is the power that gives us flowers and birds, and is the power that one day will rebuild this world in the name of justice and equity, where sorrow will be no more. The language of God's love cannot be summarized in a book, a sermon, or even church doctrine. But the force of that language is felt as the Spirit knocks us back a step, pulling us away from our own chosen path and showing us where new life awaits. The comfort of that language is felt when all hope seems to be lost, when we seem to be drowning in death and fear, but we can still stand in the morning and believe that today will be better. The challenge of that language is heard when we stand virtually or literally next to someone who looks and smells different, who speaks another language, who judges the world with a totally different set of criteria from you or me. And instead of trying to make them like us, we wonder about the way God has stirred their hearts and given them life. We worship a God who spoke life into being, but probably didn't use English words. We worship a God that defies description in the entirety of that God's work. but coaxes poetry and music from the hearts of the faithful. We worship a God who is too great to fit into the boxes and choices that we make, but who finds a way to envelop us anyway. We worship a God who loves us, but make no mistake about the power of that love. Make no mistake about the power of God's language. God loves us, and if that very thought leaves you breathless and falling on your knees, that is appropriate. And if that very thought gives you hope that your mistakes and missteps, your inadequacy and unavailability, your lack of strength and conviction, your lack of curiosity, if the thought of God's love gives you hope that despite all your shortcomings, you may just be enough, then that is appropriate. Jesus said, "Do you now believe? The hour is coming, indeed it has come, when you will be scattered, each one to his home, and you will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. I have said this to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you may face persecution, but take courage. I have conquered the world." We worship a God who speaks. Thanks be to God.